Have you ever wondered if AI like ChatGPT can come up with a way Ukraine can defeat Russia? The news from the war in Ukraine seems to be getting worse every day. The months-long delay in US military aid to Ukraine has led to the Russians gaining the upper hand. The Ukrainians are facing a critical shortage in weapons and ammunition, especially in artillery shells, and have slowly been losing ground to the Russians, especially around Avdiivka. The Russians, meanwhile, have moved their economy into a war footing, giving them a significant edge over the Ukrainians in both manpower and ammunition. It is likely going to be months before America's $61 billion aid package has any noticeable effect on the war. Every day, it is seeming more and more like the war is going to be a multi-year-long attritional war, where both sides attempt to bleed each other dry of resources and men as they pay huge prices for small territorial gains. Now, since I use ChatGPT for a lot of things these days, I naturally thought it would be interesting to ask it how it would manage the war against Russia if it were in charge of Ukraine. First, I made sure ChatGPT was as up-to-date as possible on the current situation on the front lines as of June 5th, 2024. Then, I told ChatGPT that we were going to be doing a role-playing scenario, where the AI's goal would be to liberate all Russian-occupied territory in Ukraine, and then set the stage for Ukraine's reconstruction effort after the war. Just like in previous AI videos, I'll be running all of the AI's actions through a second instance of ChatGPT I call the Arbiter, who will be determining the outcomes of each of the first AI's actions and running this simulation. Now, ChatGPT seems to be assuming here that it has full control over both the Ukrainian presidency and the Ukrainian parliament, even though I never specified that. So let's just assume the Ukrainian parliament, which is known as the Verkhovna Rada, just does whatever ChatGPT says, and so does President Zelensky. ChatGPT's first action is to lower Ukraine's draft age from 27 to 25, and enact full mobilization of all men in this age group. The AI also seems to be rehiring General Valery Zaluzhny, who, if you know, was Ukraine's former defense minister, and was relieved of his duties by Zelensky a few months ago. Through these actions, ChatGPT believes it can mobilize 500,000 new soldiers. It orders its force to immediately launch counteroffensives targeting Bakhmut and Avdiivka, with the goal of capturing these cities by mid-July. Now here's where I stopped the AI, and went like, wait a second. You're sending your troops to attack heavily fortified positions only a few weeks after mobilizing new conscripts? Doesn't that not make sense to you? Shouldn't you wait a few months to fully mobilize and train your new conscripts before launching your offensive? And ChatGPT basically responded, good point. However, I had already run this action through the Arbiter, who had determined that ChatGPT's Ukraine would suffer heavy losses as it failed to assault the heavily fortified Russian positions. After this failure, ChatGPT provided a new timeline for training its newly mobilized conscripts and deploying them into counteroffensive operations. ChatGPT now expected it to take around 18 weeks to fully train and deploy its 500,000 new conscripts, with the first batches of new troops deploying to the front line by October 2024. I asked the Arbiter to determine what actions Russia would take in the few months between now and when ChatGPT has these new troops ready, as well as the outcomes of these actions. Russian forces expand their offensive in Kharkiv Oblast, capturing more villages on the border, and advancing against heavy Ukrainian resistance a few kilometers closer to Kharkiv city. At the same time, they increase their bombardment of Kharkiv city. In the Donbass, the Russians continue to capitalize on their momentum from the capture of Avdiivka, continuing their push towards Kramatorsk, one of the last two major Ukrainian cities still holding out in the Donbass. The Russians pile more troops into the Battle of Chasiv Yar, one of the last remaining strongholds on the road to Kramatorsk. Russian forces advance deep inside the city, outnumbering the Ukrainians and firing significantly more artillery in a battle reminiscent of previous Russian victories at Bakhmut and Avdiivka. However, ChatGPT is determined to hold the line at Chasiv Yar. To preserve the nation's morale, ChatGPT initiates an information warfare campaign. Thousands of AI-powered bots flood the internet, declaring that Chasiv Yar is Russia's final chance to capture Ukrainian territory before the 500,000 conscripts can shift the tide of war back in Ukraine's favor. Emboldened by this, Ukrainian forces hold the line at Chasiv Yar, despite sustaining heavy casualties. After Russian forces have been mauled in the battle, ChatGPT orders Ukrainian forces to launch counterattacks against Russian positions. These counterattacks see limited success, pushing the Russians out of some areas of Chasiv Yar. By August, Ukraine gains access to F-16s in large numbers, which ChatGPT uses to support ground operations in the Battle of Chasiv Yar, further reversing Russian advances in the city. By August, Russia has failed to capture Chasiv Yar and mostly halts its attempts to seize the city. Throughout September, the Russians launched small probing attacks along the front line in southern Ukraine. However, Ukraine under ChatGPT responds in kind, using Western-supplied long-range missiles to strike Russian supply lines and command centers deep inside Russian territory. At the same time, ChatGPT grows increasingly confident in deploying Ukrainian special forces inside Russian territory, where they strike and sabotage Russian military assets. The AI then strikes a deal with Western defense contractors to begin development of advanced autonomous drone swarms, which would use machine learning to evade Russian air defenses, before dropping munitions on Russians behind the front lines, or deliberately crashing into Russian equipment, exploding upon impact. ChatGPT also initiates rapid development of autonomous ground vehicles, with the aim of deploying them on the front lines within 2 years. By October 2024, the first attachments of the 500,000 mobilized conscripts are ready for deployment. ChatGPT now decides to initiate its first major counteroffensive. Tens of thousands of these new troops then begin assaulting Russian positions in northern Kharkiv. By mid-October, ChatGPT has expelled the Russians from much of northern Kharkiv Oblast. It then redeploys tens of thousands of troops to Chasiv Yar, with the goal of pushing to Bakhmut by New Year's. When I told the Arbiter this, it said that ChatGPT was being overly optimistic. Here's what the Arbiter decided would happen. The Bakhmut counteroffensive initially sees some success, pushing the Russians out of heavily fortified positions and forcing them to retreat several kilometers away from Chasiv Yar. However, the Ukrainians suffer extremely heavy casualties, and their progress stalls before Ukrainian forces can approach Bakhmut, as Ukraine lacks enough artillery shells and ammunition to sustain the offensive. At the same time, the $61 billion of U.S. military aid from earlier in the year is beginning to dry up, and far-right Republicans in Congress refuse to approve a new military aid package before America's November elections. Despite this, ChatGPT refuses to let its offensive momentum stall. In November, the AI launches a huge offensive in Kherson, ordering 20,000 Ukrainian troops to cross the Dnieper River into Russian-occupied territory in Kherson Oblast. Wow, I wonder what the Arbiter will think of this move. Understandably, the Arbiter thought that the original ChatGPT's plan was wildly unrealistic, and determined that the Ukrainian offensive would halt after only 3 weeks, with the Ukrainians only capturing the town of Oleshki and suffering nearly 4,000 casualties. After this disastrous failure, ChatGPT halts further offensive operations until it receives a new U.S. aid package. Everything now hinges on the U.S. presidential election. Fortunately, the Arbiter determines that in this timeline, Democrats win the 2024 presidential election and win majorities in both chambers of Congress. Once the new 120th Congress takes office in January 2025, the U.S. passes a massive $80 billion aid package for Ukraine. Utilizing this new infusion of aid, ChatGPT begins prepping for a huge summer 2025 counteroffensive, which it predicts will liberate all of southern Ukraine and allow Ukrainian forces to liberate all of Crimea by 2026. However, the Arbiter still thinks this is an incredibly unrealistic timeline. At a meeting between ChatGPT and all of its advisors, the AI is convinced to delay offensive operations into 2026 in order to allow Ukrainian forces more time to prepare and upgrade their equipment. During the first half of 2025, Ukraine enhances its military capabilities by acquiring advanced weaponry, financial support, and technological assistance. Intensive training programs are implemented, concentrating on urban warfare, combined arms operations, and the integration of new technologies. Ukrainian intelligence and reconnaissance efforts are significantly bolstered using drones, satellites, and cyber operations to gather detailed intelligence on Russian positions and supply lines. Logistical networks and critical infrastructure are improved to support sustained operations, ensuring robust logistical support for extended military campaigns. The focus during this period is on building a foundation for successful future offensives, addressing the shortcomings identified in previous operations, and ensuring that all units are well prepared and equipped. Meanwhile, Russia focuses on consolidating its gains and strengthening its defensive positions in occupied territories. This includes fortifying urban centers, enhancing logistics and supply lines, and increasing the deployment of advanced air defense systems to counter Ukrainian air and missile strikes. During the spring and early summer, Russia conducts strategic offensives aimed at disrupting Ukrainian preparations for major operations and gaining more territory. The main Russian offensive is concentrated on the city of Vovchansk in Donetsk. A smaller, diversionary offensive is launched in northern Kharkiv Oblast, similar to what Russia did the previous year. However, by now, Russia's military advantages have significantly faded, and both their offensives fail spectacularly, with the Russian army incurring tens of thousands of casualties. As the year progresses into fall and winter, Russia shifts its strategy towards a more defensive posture, focusing on attrition warfare to wear down Ukrainian forces. In the latter half of 2025, Ukrainian forces initiate targeted air and missile strikes on Russian supply depots, command centers, and key defensive positions in Kherson and Donetsk oblasts. These precision strikes, utilizing F-16s, aim to degrade Russian capabilities and reduce resistance to future ground operations. At the same time, Ukraine deploys its AI-powered drone swarms into combat on the front line. These drones, equipped with AI algorithms, can autonomously identify and engage targets, providing real-time intelligence and precision strikes. The use of drone swarms disrupts Russian logistics and command structures, creating a significant tactical advantage. These drones are designed to be cheap and expendable, so that they can be mass-produced by Ukraine. Swarms consisting of hundreds of drones then begin harassing the Russian front line, creating gaps in Russian defenses that Ukrainian forces are able to exploit. ChatGPT also directs Ukraine to begin massively expanding its fleet of sea drones, similarly deploying hundreds of cheap sea drones in what are now routine operations to destroy Russian ships in the Black Sea. Simultaneously, autonomous ground vehicles, or AGVs, are integrated into frontline operations. These AGVs are utilized for various purposes, including logistics support, battlefield reconnaissance, and direct combat roles. They reduce the risk to human soldiers by performing dangerous tasks, such as mine clearance and supply delivery under fire. The integration of these technologies is facilitated through close collaboration with Western defense contractors and tech companies, ensuring that Ukrainian forces benefit from the latest advancements in military technology. During this time, ChatGPT also significantly ramps up production of artillery shells and ammunition factories in Ukraine. Concurrently, reconnaissance-enforced missions and probing attacks are executed to test Russian defenses, gather intelligence, and identify vulnerabilities. Small mobile units conduct these operations to avoid significant casualties while gaining valuable information. Preparation for a coordinated multi-front offensive begins, focusing on Kherson, Donetsk, and targeted areas in Crimea. By the end of 2025, Ukrainian forces are poised for comprehensive offensive operations, having identified weak points and refined their plans based on the intelligence gathered throughout the year. Throughout the first few months of 2026, ChatGPT directs Ukrainian forces to begin significantly degrading Russian frontline defenses in preparation for Ukraine's expected spring offensive. Ukrainian F-16s conduct bolder and bolder operations, targeting and destroying Russian air defenses and air bases, even inside Russian territory. At the same time, the Ukrainians wage a successful campaign of counter-battery warfare, significantly reducing the number of Russian artillery pieces operating on the front line. On April 15, 2026, Ukraine launches its spring offensive, targeting Russian positions in Zaporizhia, Kherson, and Donetsk. This operation, meticulously planned over the preceding months, involves a combination of airstrikes, artillery barrages, and coordinated ground assaults. The Ukrainian ground forces, comprising mechanized infantry and armored units, advance under the cover of air support and heavy artillery. Within a few weeks, the Ukrainians have advanced rapidly, liberating the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, Europe's second largest nuclear power plant, from Russian occupation. Ukrainian forces then push deeper into Kherson Oblast, linking up with other Ukrainian troops stationed at Oleshki on the eastern bank of the Dnieper River. Ukrainian forces in Donetsk make small gains against heavily fortified Russian defenses. On July 1st, Ukraine launches the second phase of its counter-offensive, flooding the Kherson region with over 100,000 troops and pushing towards the coast on the Sea of Azov. The Russian defenses in southern Ukraine begin to completely collapse, and Putin directly orders a withdrawal of all Russian forces from Kherson and Zaporizhia. Russian troops then hastily fall back to more defensible lines in Donetsk and Crimea, suffering immense casualties in a disorganized rout. Ukrainians jubilantly liberate the city of Melitopol, then press onward to Donetsk. Ukrainian forces then bear down on Donetsk and Luhansk across the entire front line, liberating Bakhmut and pushing Russian forces back to Avdiivka. In September 2026, the Second Battle of Mariupol begins, as Ukrainian forces finally reach the long-occupied port city. The Ukrainian and Russian armies engage in fierce fighting over control of the city for around 2 months, which results in the Ukrainians fully expelling the Russian occupiers from the city. Simultaneously, Ukrainian forces begin advancing deeply in Luhansk and northern Donetsk. In November 2026, Ukrainian forces encircle a huge number of Russian forces in the city of Avdiivka, leading to the largest mass surrender of Russian forces since World War II. This huge victory at Avdiivka allows the Ukrainians to push on to Donetsk city, beginning the battle for the capital city of Donetsk Oblast. It is now the end of 2026, and so I decided to now ask the Arbiter what it determined the casualties for the entire war since 2022 would be at this point. The Arbiter determined that the war at this point would have seen 1.2 million casualties, with 800,000 Russian casualties and 400,000 Ukrainian casualties. This includes around 200,000 dead Russian soldiers. The first few months of 2027 sees the war return to another phase of attritional warfare, with both sides grinding each other down in daily battles on the front line as they re-equip and prepare themselves for summer offensives. With Russian forces confined to an increasingly smaller territory in Ukraine, Ukraine is able to concentrate their artillery and missile strikes on Russian targets, significantly hindering the Russians' ability to reinforce their defenses in the Donbass. In July 2027, the Ukrainians initiate a huge new counteroffensive, driving deep into Luhansk Oblast. They fully liberate the cities of Lysychansk and Syeverodonetsk, pushing all the way to Starobilsk before stopping to create new defensive lines along the Idar River. By September, Ukrainian forces have reached Luhansk city. Much of the fighting in the war now hinges on the twin battles of Donetsk and Luhansk cities. The next few months of war sees Russian and Ukrainian forces engaged in grueling attritional urban warfare. Putin refuses to engage in any kind of diplomacy or withdraw entirely, instead doubling down on the war. The Russian dictator issues another wave of massive mobilization orders, this time drafting thousands of Russian young men from the Russian metropolises of Moscow and St. Petersburg. As we are now reaching the end of 2027, I now ask the Arbiter how many casualties Russia has sustained so far in the war. The Arbiter tells me that Russia's total casualties alone have now increased to 1.2 million, with 300,000 soldiers dead and 900,000 wounded. In January 2028, an unprecedented wave of protests break out across Russia in response to the rising death rate and new mobilization orders. Protesters completely destabilize the Russian state, burning draft offices, and preventing Russia from gaining new recruits from the cities. By February, these protests dramatically escalate, spreading to the cities of Yekaterinburg, Kazan, and Novosibirsk. Putin deploys the police and FSB in the streets to violently suppress the protests. Hundreds of activists are killed in the weeks of ensuing violence. Meanwhile, in March, Ukrainian forces finally begin their operation to liberate Crimea. Ukrainian forces conduct amphibious landings at various points throughout the Crimean Peninsula. Russian soldiers throughout Crimea are isolated and low on ammunition and food after years of Ukrainian missile strikes on their supply lines from mainland Russia. Much of the peninsula quickly falls under Ukrainian control, with the last Russian troops holding up at the cities of Simferopol and Sevastopol. News of the shocking defeat plunges Russia into chaos, giving further energy to the mass protest movement. By June, the size of the protests is in the millions, and has now morphed into an anti-war movement. Putin manages to quell the growing revolt by releasing political prisoners, ending the draft, and promising to review military strategies in the war. By August 2028, Russian forces in Simferopol and Sevastopol surrender, leaving Ukraine with uncontested control over a fully liberated Crimea for the first time in 14 years. Throughout the last few months of 2028, Russian forces in the Donbass begin to experience a severe manpower shortage, driven largely by the cancellation of the draft. This allows Ukrainian forces to seize more and more ground around Donetsk city, eventually forcing the Russians to completely withdraw by December 2028. In early 2029, Putin dies of natural causes, triggering a huge political crisis in Russia. Amidst this power vacuum, Russian forces are ejected from Luhansk city, and the last Russian forces withdraw from all of southeastern Ukraine by the summer of 2029. With all of Ukraine now liberated from Russian occupation, and the Russian government in the middle of a power vacuum and unprecedented political crisis, it is safe to say that the war is over, and Ukraine has won. As ChatGPT has controlled Ukraine for the past 5 years in this world, it is clear that ChatGPT has succeeded in its mission to save Ukraine. However, Ukraine still faces a number of issues, ranging from the hundreds of billions of dollars needed for its reconstruction, to its application for membership in NATO and the EU, to its demographic crisis, and millions of refugees now living abroad. So, I asked ChatGPT how it would rebuild Ukraine. ChatGPT's Ukraine first establishes specialized units for mine clearance, making use of its fleet of AGVs to clear the southern and eastern Ukrainian countrysides of mines. To attract Ukrainian refugees back home and encourage Western investment, ChatGPT provides a huge number of grants to businesses, especially grain farmers, and implements new tax incentives. ChatGPT also begins subsidizing Ukrainian-born defense and research companies, which sprung up during the war. To pay for this, ChatGPT lobbies for additional aid from Western governments, including the ability to spend Russia's $400 billion in frozen assets on the reconstruction effort. ChatGPT also passes laws that strengthen the power and the independence of the Ukrainian judiciary, which it hopes will significantly reduce corruption and strengthen democracy, and thus aid in its ascension to membership in the European Union. ChatGPT's Ukraine also begins construction of a new high-speed railway system throughout the country, and uses a huge new influx of Western aid to completely rebuild the destroyed cities of Mariupol and Donetsk. These cities are redesigned from the ground up, incorporating the latest high-tech developments in urban planning. Now, it's time to ask the Arbiter how this reconstruction effort will pan out, and how the war in this timeline will affect the wider geopolitics of the world over the course of the next 20 years. By 2030, much of the West has approved to not only give billions of dollars in aid towards Ukraine's reconstruction, but also to use Russia's frozen assets to partially pay for it. The reconstruction of Ukraine begins. Some of the millions of Ukrainian refugees abroad return, but not all, and Ukraine's economic revitalization is hampered by its increasingly bad demographics. Ukrainian cooperation with NATO increases throughout the early 2030s, until Ukraine achieves full membership in NATO in 2036. Meanwhile, Russia falls under the thumb of another despotic ruler, who cracks down on dissent and centralizes their authority, but walks back from further confrontations with the West, seeking a new détente. By 2040, ChatGPT's Ukraine has mostly completed its slow reconstruction effort. Ukraine has joined the European Union, and with Russia severely weakened, much of the West's enemies around the globe exercise more caution when engaging with the West. The rules-based international order that Russia attempted to break when it started the war in 2022 continues to remain in existence.